So the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are Noble Truth of suffering, the Noble Truth of the origin of suffering, the Noble Truth of the cessation of suffering, and the Noble Truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. They are called Noble Truths because they are penetrated by the Noble Ones. Now the Noble Ones are those who have reached any stage of enlightenment. So a person who reaches the first stage of enlightenment is said to see all these Four Noble Truths. So they are called Noble Truths because they are penetrated by the Noble Ones, and also they are called Noble Truths because they are taught by the noblest of the nobles, that is the Buddha. And also they are called Noble Truths because they lead to the state of a Noble One. That means when a person realizes these Four Noble Truths, he is called a noble person. So they are called Noble Truths because they make anyone who realizes them become a noble one. And also they are called Noble Truths because they are real. They are unalterable, undeceptive truths about existence. So they are called Four Noble Truths. It is strange in Buddhism that there are Four Noble Truths and not just one truth. Now many people say there is only one truth, and then different teachers taught it in different ways. But in the teachings of the Buddha, there are Four Noble Truths, not just one. And truth here means just something that is true, that is not otherwise than is stated. So in the teachings of the Buddha, a truth does not need to be wholesome or lofty, whether it is wholesome or unwholesome, whether it is lowly or high. If it is true, then it is called a truth. Now the second noble truth is craving, tanha. It is an unwholesome mental state. But this unwholesome mental state is called a noble truth because it is the real cause of suffering. Now the first of them is the noble truth of suffering. And noble truth of suffering is explained by the Buddha in his first sermon as birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair are suffering, association with the unpleasant is suffering, separation from the pleasant. Pleasant means unpleasant things and unpleasant beings. So separation from the pleasant is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. And the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. So this is the definition given by the Buddha himself in the first sermon. If I have to talk about this in detail, it may take some more hours. In July I went to Japan and I gave talks on these Four Noble Truths in detail, and it took me 6 hours. There are many books on the Four Noble Truths, and the one written by the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Yeah, you haven't? Oh. What was that you wrote? Noble Eightfold Path. Oh, right. Oh, okay. Now, by the way, I failed to introduce Bhikkhu Bodhi to you because I thought you already know him. Now, say you are studying his book for now almost a year, But now you are seeing him in person. Now this Venerable is Bhikkhu Bodhi.
No, I put it together about 12 or 13 years ago. So it seems rather strange to me now. I'm reading it as though I'm learning for the first time.
So, I am teaching his book and he is attending the class. Okay. So then there are many books and you can choose any book and read to know all of in more detail. So I cannot go into many details here. So the noble truth of suffering is described as birth is suffering and so on, and you can easily understand that birth is suffering, aging is suffering. To get old is suffering. You don't want to get old, but you get old, and so that is suffering and so on. But it is important that the last one you understand. The last one Buddha said was, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. That we must understand. Because the 5 aggregates of clinging includes what we call happiness, what we call enjoyment. So people enjoy something, enjoy good food, enjoy companionship, enjoy sight and so on. So that is enjoyment and that should be happiness. But according to this definition, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. They are also suffering. So why are they called suffering? Why are they given the name suffering by the Buddha? Although we think that they are enjoyable. Now we must remember Buddha's another definition that whatever is impermanent is suffering. Now that we must hold on to firmly. Whatever is impermanent is suffering. So if you want to know whether something is suffering or not, find out whether it is impermanent or not. And if you want to know anything is impermanent or not, find out whether it has a beginning and an end. So if it has a beginning and an end, it is impermanent. And if it is impermanent, it is suffering according to Buddha's definition. And here, suffering does not mean pain. Pain as suffering is very, very easy to understand. But here, suffering means being constantly oppressed by rise and fall. Now, that is the characteristic of being dukkha or suffering. So, what is the mark or characteristic of suffering? Being constantly oppressed by arising and disappearing. So everything is afflicted with arising and disappearing, rise and fall. Everything has rise and fall. Even what we call pleasures, enjoyment, have a beginning and an end, or arising and disappearing. So even when we are in the process of enjoying something, we are being bombarded by this arising and disappearing, arising and disappearing. So actually, according to the Buddha's definition, we are suffering when we think we are enjoying. So we must understand this. If we understand this definition of dukkha, then we can easily accept that the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. So this is the understanding of suffering on a philosophical level. That birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering. It is not difficult to understand. We can understand easily. But the last one is the most difficult to understand. And so we must understand the definition given by the Buddha as whatever is impermanent is suffering. So according to this teaching, everything in the world is suffering. But when we talk about the noble truth of suffering, we are concerned with the living beings only. So we are not to say that this is suffering, a tree is suffering, a stone is suffering, a rock is suffering. We don't say that, although they have the rising and disappearing or rise and fall. So we are concerned with the living beings. Now second noble truth is called noble truth of the origin of suffering, or the cause of suffering. So what causes suffering? The Buddha said that craving causes suffering. So craving is the cause of suffering. Because we have craving, we are attached to our lives, we are reborn again and again. So rebirth really means arising of some aggregates. Since the aggregates are suffering, rebirth is itself suffering. And this rebirth is caused by the craving in the past life. We crave or we are attached to something, and that attachment produces a rebirth. Now, attachment is a mental state. This mental state has the power, a potential to give results, and the result in the form of rebirth. So, the rebirth is caused by the attachment in the past, and that rebirth is nothing but suffering, and so the attachment is the cause of suffering. And the craving is said to be of three kinds: the craving for sense objects, and craving associated with the view of eternity, and craving associated with the view of annihilation. Now, view of eternity means the view that things are permanent. The beings are permanent, Atman is permanent, and so on. And annihilation view means after death there is no more, nothing. So death is the end of all things, and there is no more after death. So that is the view of annihilation. So craving associated with that view is called the craving for annihilation, not actually craving to be annihilated. At one time, I gave a book to a man and he read, and then after a few days he came back and said, Buddha talked about, say, suicide, and Buddha allows suicide. I was surprised. So where did you find that? Then he said, here is a craving for annihilation. So I have to explain to him that this is not craving for annihilation, actually. Craving that is associated with the view that beings are annihilated at death and no more of them after that. So there are three kinds of craving. And craving causes rebirth, which is, in ultimate analysis, suffering, and so the craving is said to be the origin or cause of suffering. And then the third noble truth is the cessation of suffering. This is the stoppage of suffering. And cessation of suffering is actually nibbana. So only the dukkha or suffering ceases when we realize nibbana or when we reach nibbana. And it is achieved when craving is eradicated. And the fourth noble truth is the path or the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And it is actually the Eightfold Noble Path, or Noble Eightfold Path. Now, the first noble truth is like a diagnosis. So a physician diagnoses a patient to have a kind of disease. So you have this disease. And then he knows the cause of the disease. And he knows that the disease can be cured. And he also knows what medicine to give to that patient. So the four noble truths are like that. The first noble truth is like a disease. The second noble truth is like the cause of disease. Third noble truth is the cure of the disease. And the fourth noble truth is a medicine. So what is most important when a person has a disease is to take the medicine. So here Buddha said, now you have this disease, dukkha disease. and I know what causes it, and I know that it can be cured, and this is what you have to do. And he gave us the Noble Eightfold Path, the fourth Noble Truth. So actually, among the Four Noble Truths, the fourth Noble Truth is the most important for us. And we have to practice it, not just know it, not just understand it. Just knowing it or just understanding it will not help us to get rid of suffering. So in order to get rid of suffering, we have to put into practice what Buddha taught us, the Eightfold Path or practice of meditation. So Buddha's teachings are like medicine, and so long as we do not take the medicine, we will not get cured. We may have hundreds of bottles of medicine at home, but if you do not take any one of them, you will not get any benefit from the medicine. So medicine is to be taken. In the same way, Buddha's teaching, especially the Fourth Noble Truth, is to be practiced. So when we practice the Eightfold Path, as the Buddha did, we will also attain what we aim for. So among the Four Noble Truths, the Fourth Noble Truth is the most important for us. First, we must understand the Four Noble Truths and also the Fourth Noble Truth, and we must understand the components in the Fourth Noble Truth, and we must practice these components, or we must practice the factors making up this Eightfold Path. You all know the factors of the Eightfold Path. We have been talking about it again and again, and we have with them in this chapter 2 times. The path factors, right? In the second section and in the third section we met them. Right understanding, right thought, and so on. And so we must practice them so as to achieve the cessation of suffering, or so as to eradicate the mental defilements, so as to eradicate the craving and achieve the cessation of suffering. So by practicing the Fourth Noble Truth, we abandon the Second Noble Truth, and we realize the Third Noble Truth, and we get out of the First Noble Truth. So the Fourth Noble Truth is the most important. And there is a note here in the manual. It should be noted that while in the section on the requisites of enlightenment, the 8 path factors may be either mundane or supramundane. So among the Bodhipakkhaya Dhammas or requisites of enlightenment, the 8 path factors can be either mundane or supramundane. But in the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, they are exclusively supramundane. So first, what does the Noble Truth of suffering represent? What it is that we say is suffering? The fourth is exclusively supramundane. So the first Noble Truth is everything except the supramundane states. So mundane cetas and the cetasikas going along with them, and all rupas or material properties. Now there are 4 ultimate truths: consciousness, mental factors, material properties, and nibbana. From among them, the mundane cetas and the cetasikas going along with it, and 28 material properties are, or they belong to, the first Noble Truth of suffering. And the second Noble Truth is the cetasika, lobha. Now, craving means attachment, so lobha. And the third Noble Truth is nibbana. Now it is supramundane. And the fourth Noble Truth is the 8 factors, 8 cetasikas. And the 8 cetasikas belong to the fourth Noble Truth only when they arise with Magga consciousness and Phala consciousness, or only when they arise with supramundane consciousness. So the real fourth noble truth is actually the outcome of the practice of the preliminary noble eightfold path. So we divide eightfold path into preliminary and the real eightfold path. So without the practice of the preliminary eightfold path, we cannot reach the real eightfold path. Now the last verse in this chapter. Mental states associated with the paths and the fruits are excluded from the four truths. So there are some things that are out of the four noble truths. Normally we would say everything is included in the four noble truths. But according to Abhidhamma, there are some states that are outside the four noble truths. And what are they? Mental states associated with the paths and the fruits are excluded from the four truths. And let us take the first supramundane citta, Sotapatti Magga. And along with that citta, there arise 36 mental factors. Among the 36 mental factors, there are 8 factors of the Eightfold Path. These 8 factors are called the Eightfold Path or the Fourth Noble Truth. But the Magga Citta itself, is it included in First Noble Truth? No. Second Noble Truth? No. Third Noble Truth? Fourth Noble Truth? No. So, Magga Citta is outside the Four Noble Truths. And also the mental factors other than the 8. So 36 minus 8, 20, 28. So they are also outside the Four Noble Truths. They do not fit in any of the Four Noble Truths. They are not included in the First Noble Truth. They are not Second Noble Truth. They are not Third Noble Truth. And they are not included in the Fourth Noble Truth. So they are also outside the Four Noble Truths. And then let us take fruition consciousness, Phala consciousness. With fruition consciousness also 36 mental factors arise. And among 36 there are these 8 factors. But these 8 factors that arise simultaneously with the fruition consciousness are not called Fourth Truth. So they are outside the Four Noble Truths, because they do not belong to the First Noble Truth, Second Noble Truth, Third Noble Truth, and also they do not belong to Fourth Noble Truth. So those that belong to the Fourth Noble Truths are those that arise with the path consciousness, not with fruition consciousness. So those that arise with fruition consciousness are also outside the Four Noble Truths. So, how many states are there that we can call outside the Four Noble Truths? 1, path consciousness, and 28 mental factors. 28 mental factors means 36 minus 8. And fruition consciousness and all mental factors going along with them. So they are outside the Four Noble Truths. They do not fit into any of the Four Noble Truths. Now the Four Noble Truths are discovered by the Buddha, and then he taught the Four Noble Truths to the world. So Four Noble Truths are not created by the Buddha. They are discovered by the Buddha. And then Buddha revealed them to the world. And he taught the Four Noble Truths in his first sermon. So when he gave his first sermon to his 5 disciples, he taught the Four Noble Truths there. So the teaching of Four Noble Truths is very important in the teachings of the Buddha. And we all need to at least understand theoretically the Four Noble Truths, and then we try to understand them experientially. So that is, we practice meditation, and through practice of meditation we'll be able to see all these Four Noble Truths. And to see means to experience ourselves and not just understand and through reading or listening to talks. So these are the Four Noble Truths explained or just mentioned in this section. This section is called section of the whole or section of the all. That means they include all ultimate realities. Now, in this chapter, in the 7th chapter, we have studied the asavas and so on, and so we now have a good knowledge of different names given to different mental factors and also material properties. And to understand the teachings of the Buddha, when we read the discourses and when we read the Abhidhamma, it is important that we are familiar with these teachings or these terms. If we do not know these terms according to Abhidhamma, we may misunderstand some of the teachings, or we may not understand the teachings at all. So it is important that we are familiar with these. And also, the author is giving us this information here, not just giving us information, actually, he is preparing us for the 9th chapter. In the 9th chapter, the meditation will be explained. Although these categories will not be mentioned there, still we need to have at least the theoretical knowledge of these categories so that we can practice them, we can take them as object of our observation when we practice vipassana meditation. So actually it is, in one way, it is in preparation for the vipassana meditation that the author is giving us this information in this chapter. And this chapter is not difficult to understand, as you know. Okay, we will go to the next chapter. 8th chapter. 8th chapter is, to me, the most difficult. It may not be encouraging. 8th chapter is the most difficult chapter because it deals with 2 most important teachings taught by the Buddha. The one is the Paṭiccasamuppāda, or dependent origination, and the other is Patthana, causal relations. Now, regarding the cause and effect, there are 3 kinds of views. Now, one view is there is no cause for things to arise or things to come up. They just arise and they disappear by their own free will, and so there is no cause for them, there is no condition for them. So that is one view regarding the conditionality or causality of mind and matter. And there is another view, and that view takes that, yes, there is a cause, and that cause is none other than the creation of a Brahma or a God. So things have cause, and that cause is the creation of a God. So that is another view. And there is a third view, and this third view takes that there is cause, and the cause is not the creation of a Brahma or a God, but they are conditioned by the states that arise before them or that arise simultaneously with them, and so on. So there are these three kinds of views regarding the causality of things in the world. And as you know, Buddhism advocates the third view. So according to Buddhism, nothing is uncaused. Everything is dependent on some other thing to arise. So there is always this conditionality of things in the world. So everything that happens, everything that arises has its conditions. We may not know them, but there are conditions for everything that arises or that happens in the world. And Buddha taught this conditionality of things by two teachings or two doctrines. And the first one is the dependent origination. And the second one is the 24 modes of causal relations. Both are not easy to understand. Now the first one, dependent origination, is a teaching that whatever arises regarding the living beings is conditioned by some other thing. And in this teaching, it goes like a chain reaction. Now, A conditions B, and B conditions C, and so on. According to this teaching, everything is conditioned, and so there can be no beginning of anything at all. Because if we say there is the beginning, then that beginning must be conditioned by some other thing, and so it goes on ad infinitum, and so we cannot come to the real first cause or something like that. And it teaches that these two things are related. A is related to B, and B is related to C, and so on. But it does not tell us how they are related, in what way they are related to each other. And that is taken up by the other teaching, the 24 modes of causal relations. And also the 24 modes of causal relations is more comprehensive than the dependent origination, because dependent origination is the explanation of the conditionality of mind and matter in living beings. So it does not say anything about outside world. It does not say anything about the causality of physical things. But in the other teaching, it is called Patthana, 24 modes of causality. Both animate and inanimate things are included. So we'll find explanation of the relations between matter and matter, matter and mind, mind and matter, and so on. And also the Patthana, the 24 modes of causal relations, explains to us how or in what way things are related. So it is like, suppose A and B are related, we will say. Now that is dependent origination. But Patthana would say A and B are related as father and son, or uncle and nephew, and so on. So how they are related is also explained in the 24 modes of causal relations. That is why both are very interesting, and I think these two teachings made Buddhism unique among all religions, because it teaches the causality of everything. So everything is dependent upon some other thing, and nothing is absolute, and there is no divine power or something that is involved in this rolling on of the phenomena. And so it is very interesting, but also it is difficult. So in order to understand these two, you need to be familiar with the preceding chapters. So when in the United States my disciples asked me to teach them the dependent origination, I said no. First you must study Abhidhamma. So only after they have studied Abhidhamma with me did I teach them the dependent origination in detail. It would be very good if we could study it in as much detail as possible, but as you know, time is limited for us. But we will cover as much as possible in this short class. So the first one is called dependent origination. It is translated as dependent arising and dependent co-arising. There are many other things, many other translations. The word Paṭiccasamuppāda itself is a difficult word to understand, and I don't intend to explain this to you according to the explanations given in Visuddhimagga. It's too involved. So just understand that this is a doctrine of dependent arising or dependent origination, or a doctrine that teaches that everything that arises is dependent upon some other things. And this dependent origination was known to the Buddha even before his enlightenment. Now first, let us say that dependent origination is not a creation of the Buddha. Buddha himself said, whether Tathagatas appear in the world or they do not appear in the world, there remains this structure of conditions. That means there remains this element of causality in the world. A Tathagata means Buddha. A Tathagata appears in the world and discovers it and then taught it to the world. So it is not the creation of the Buddha. Buddha did not create the dependent origination, but it is his explanation of what's going on in the world. And it seems that Buddha was familiar with dependent origination even before he became the Buddha. Now, you all know that Buddha, or rather the Bodhisattva, spent 6 years in the forest practicing meditation to attain Buddhahood. On the last day of his 6 years, let us say, to make the long story very, very short, because I think you are familiar with this Buddha's renunciation. So on the night of the full moon day of May, he sat down under the Bodhi tree, right? And he practiced meditation. He practiced anapanasati meditation, or mindfulness of breathing meditation. And he gained first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, one by one. And also he gained the 4 other immaterial jhanas, although they are not mentioned in some books. Because in order to attain a vinya, the supernormal knowledge, one needs to have attained all the material jhanas and immaterial jhanas. So he attained all these 8 or 9 jhanas. And then he practiced further, and so during the first part of the night, he gained or he attained the supernormal knowledge by which he was able to remember all his past lives. So that he gained during the first watch of the night. The night is divided into 3 parts. And he went on practicing, because that was not the end of the practice. So he went on practicing, and during the second watch of the night, around midnight, he gained another supernormal knowledge. And by that supernormal knowledge, he was able to see beings dying from one existence and being reborn in another. Also, he sees that, say, a being dies from this existence and is reborn in hell because he did, say, unwholesome deeds in the past. And then he sees another being being reborn in the world of devas, in the world of celestial beings. And then he also saw that that being was reborn in the blissful state because he did wholesome karma in the past. So that means Buddha saw the law of karma very clearly, as it were on a screen. So Buddha's teaching of karma was based on that supernormal knowledge. Many people say that Buddha borrowed the law of karma from Hindu teachings. But if you are familiar with Hindu teachings, you will know that Buddha's law of karma and the Hindu teaching of law of karma is very different. So in the law of karma taught by the Buddha, there is no agent, there is no lord or no one administering the justice or whatever. It is just the natural outcome of wholesome or unwholesome karma. So Buddha discovered the law of karma during that second or middle part of the night. And then he went on practicing, and during the last part of the night, from about 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., he practiced vipassana meditation. And when he practiced vipassana meditation, he took the factors, you will find the factors later in the doctrine of Paṭiccasamuppāda. So he took the 12 factors one by one and practiced vipassana on that factor. So practice vipassana means tried to see that factor is impermanent, suffering, and non-soul. This he did on all 12 factors of dependent origination, and it is said that he practiced millions and millions of times during these maybe 4 hours. So at that time he was not yet Buddha, he was still a bodhisattva. But even still a bodhisattva, he knew the dependent origination, he knew the factors of the dependent origination, and he practiced vipassana on each of these 12 factors again and again, again and again. And when he was practicing vipassana on the 12 factors, at times he stopped vipassana and entered into the 4th jhana. And after living in the 4th jhana for some time, he got out of 4th jhana, and then he continues his vipassana. So in this way, he entered into the 4th jhana and then went back to vipassana and so on. Why did he do that? Now it is said that vipassana is very difficult. So when you practice vipassana, what you see is what you do not want to see. What you see is dissolution, things disappearing, right? So that is what we don't want to see. But we are seeing the dissolution of things, dissolution of mind and matter when we practice vipassana meditation. And so vipassana meditation is a tough job. So when doing a tough job, we have to use our intellect or our wisdom. And that wisdom is like a sword cutting hard objects. So when you cut a hard object with a sword, it becomes blunt. Then you have to sharpen it. So you have to sharpen it and then cut again. So in the same way, when he practiced vipassana on these factors and seeing that they are impermanent and so on, his wisdom becomes maybe a little blunt. And so he went back into the fourth jhana for some time, sharpening his wisdom. And then after that he went back to vipassana and practiced again. So in this way he practiced vipassana for, let us say, for about 4 hours, for the last watch of the night. So as a result of this practice, he reached enlightenment as the dawn came. So when he reached enlightenment, that means he reached the 4 stages of enlightenment one after another in rapid succession. First, say, Sotapaddi stage, and then Sakadagami stage, and so on. So when the dawn came, then he reached the 4th stage of enlightenment, and he became the Buddha. As soon as he reached the 4th stage of enlightenment, omniscience also came to him, knowing whatever he wants to know. So he was endowed with this destruction of defilements and all-knowing wisdom. So what I want to say here is the dependent origination was familiar to the Buddha even before he became the Buddha. And he practiced vipassana on the 12 factors of the dependent origination, and he contemplates on them many times, millions of times. And that is why vipassana he practiced there under the Bodhi tree is called Maha Vipassana, the grand vipassana, not like vipassana we do here. So Buddha's vipassana was a grand vipassana, taking the 12 factors of dependent origination one by one and contemplating on them as anicca, dukkha and anatta. Okay, so he reached the 4th stage of enlightenment and he became the Buddha. Now after he became the Buddha, he sat on that spot for 7 days without breaking his sitting. And while he was sitting there for 7 days under the Bodhi tree, he was again contemplating on the dependent origination in the regular order and in the reverse order. Now regular order means the arising and reverse order means cessation, not backward. But cessation is called here reverse order. So he was contemplating on the dependent origination for 7 days under the Bodhi tree after he became the Buddha. And then after that, say 2 months after his enlightenment, he started his teaching. So from that time on, he taught the dependent origination many times. Now his ministry lasted for 45 years. So during these 45 years, he taught the dependent origination many times. And you can find the teaching of dependent origination in many books, especially in the collection called Samyutta Nikaya. So he taught the dependent origination again and again during these 45 years. Since he was very familiar with the dependent origination, his teachings are varied, different. He taught differently to different audiences or different beings. Sometimes he would pick up in the beginning and then he would go to the end. Sometimes he would pick up from the end and then go backward to the beginning. And sometimes he would pick up in the middle and go forward or backward. So he was so adept with this dependent origination that he taught in many different ways. So now we are going to study this dependent origination, or dependent arising, whatever you may call it. First, I want you to be familiar with the formula of the dependent origination. The regular formula for dependent origination begins with avijja, paccaya, sankhara, and so on. But there is a short form of that formula also, and you can find that on page 293, about the middle of the page. If you don't want to learn the long formula, you can just memorize this short formula. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. This is a very brief statement of dependent origination. So for those who are very gifted, just this may be enough. But for us, no. So we have to go to the detailed teaching of the dependent origination. So here, when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. So this is a very, very, very short but meaningful dictum. So when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. In Pali here, imasming sati idang hoti, imasuppada idang upajjati. So, and there is another verse describing the dependent origination in brief. And that verse was actually taught to the Venerable Sariputta by the Venerable Assaji. Now, Venerable Sariputta, before he became the Venerable Sariputta, he was an ascetic belonging to a different teaching. So one day he saw the Venerable Assaji, who was the youngest of the 5 disciples of the Buddha. And he was pleased with the Venerable Assaji's demeanor, and so he approached Venerable Assaji and asked who his teacher was and what teaching he teaches and so on. And so the Venerable Assaji said, I don't know much, I am new to this teaching. Then Sariputta said, either much or little, just tell me. I can understand even if you give me just a little bit. So the Venerable Assaji uttered a verse, and you may be familiar with that verse also. Ye dhamma hitu pabhava, te sang hitung tathagato aha, and so on. So that means there are states that springs from the cause. That cause the Buddha teaches. And also their cessation Buddha teaches. So this is a teaching of the Buddha. And for Venerable Sariputta, it is more than enough. There are 4 lines in this verse. After listening the first 2 lines, he became a Sotapanna. So that verse also gave us the teaching of Paṭiccasamuppāda or dependent origination in a very brief form. So whatever states arise from the cause, that cause Buddha declared. And also he declared the cessation of this. So actually the Four Noble Truths are included in that also. But we are not so gifted as the Venerable Sariputta, and so we have to go through the detailed explanation of this to understand. So the dependent origination, or here it is called dependent arising. So dependent arising, the formula for dependent arising you will see on page 294. If you don't mind, I would like you to memorize the Pali also. Avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijñānam, vijñāna paccaya nama rupam, nama rupa paccaya salayatanam, salayatana paccaya phasso, phassa paccaya vedana, vedana paccaya tanha, tanha paccaya upadhanam, upadhana paccaya bhavo, bhava paccaya jati, jati paccaya jara marana, soka parideva dukkha domana supayasa sambhavanti, eva metassa kevalassa dukkha khandassa samudayo hoti. That is the Paṭiccasamuppāda or dependent origination. And then the translation you see below. Dependent on ignorance arise karmic formations, and dependent on karmic formations arises consciousness. Dependent on consciousness arises mind and matter. Dependent on mind and matter arise the six sense bases. Dependent on six sense bases arise contact. Dependent on contact arises feeling. Dependent on feeling arises craving. Dependent on craving arises clinging. Dependent on clinging arises existence. Dependent on existence arises birth. Dependent on birth arise decay and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair. Thus arises this whole mass of suffering. So this is a formula for the dependent origination. But there are many terms that need explanation. So we just don't understand by reading this translation, like karmic formations and then existence and so on. So we have to go into more detail to understand the dependent origination. So we'll continue our study of dependent origination tomorrow. So there is one question here. Sayadaw has taught that unwholesome states cannot overcome wholesome states. So overcome means actually to abandon or to destroy. At the same time, it has often been taught that all beings were originally enlightened. But according to Theravada Buddhism, it is not true. All beings were originally enlightened. If all beings were originally enlightened, then why practice for enlightenment? You are already enlightened and you don't need to do anything to get enlightenment. So maybe in Mahayana it is not that way, I'm not sure. So all beings were originally enlightened. Can Sayadaw help reconcile these two teachings? So actually all beings were not originally enlightened, and according to the teachings of Theravada, we begin with our life with lobha. It is said that in the first thought process of rebirth, the first jhana movement is always accompanied by lobha. It is called bhava nikanti. That means attachment to bhava. So when a person is reborn in existence, then the first jhana movement that arises in that person, in that being, is always accompanied by attachment to that life. Whether a being is born in hell or in states of misery, there is invariably this attachment to life. So actually we begin with akusala, or unwholesome. And also we have this latent tendency of the mental defilements in our mental continuity, and to eradicate those latent tendencies, we practice meditation. So if we have no latent tendencies in our minds, if our minds are pure, then we don't need to practice meditation to make it pure. So we are not originally enlightened, or we are not enlightened at all until we practice meditation and we get enlightenment. And the second one is, how can one ensure that one's next rebirth ceta is a sahetuka patisanti ceta with alobha, adosa and panya? How can one know if one's bhavanga ceta has alobha, adosa and panya? Now, to ensure that one's next rebirth ceta is a sahetuka patisanti ceta with alobha, adosa and panya, one has to take care that whenever one does a meritorious deed, it should be accompanied by these three roots: alobha, adosa and amoha or panya. So it is very important that whenever you do a meritorious deed, your mind or your consciousness must be accompanied by these three roots. Alobha means non-greed, adosa means non-hate, and amoha means understanding, panya. Because only when the karma performed here is accompanied by these three roots will the result be with three roots. Even then, you have to do it so that this three-root wholesome karma is the best one. If it is not the best one, if it is an inferior, or if it is of inferior class, then your rebirth consciousness will not be accompanied by panya. So that, I think I explained in the 5th chapter. In the 5th chapter, there are mentioned the karma as three-root superior, three-root inferior, and so on. Only three-root superior can give results as three-root rebirth. So, to ensure that your next rebirth ceta is sahetuka patisanti ceta with alobha, adosa and panya, then you have to be careful when you do meritorious deeds. Don't do meritorious deeds causally or carelessly. Try to think of the law of karma when you do meritorious deed, that you believe in the law of karma, you believe that there is karma, and you also believe there are the results of karma, and so on. And so with that understanding, you do the meritorious deed. So that is very important, and I would like to ask you to be careful when you do meritorious deeds, because most people do it without thinking of the law of karma. Although they have belief in law of karma, it should be invoked at the moment of, say, doing the meritorious deed. Suppose you are doing a dana, you are doing a giving. So at the moment of giving, your mind should be accompanied by that understanding of law of karma. Basically, you believe in the law of karma, that's why you are Buddhist. But if you do not invoke that understanding right at that moment, then your consciousness at that moment is not accompanied by understanding. That means your merit is not accompanied by 3 roots. So if your merit is not accompanied by 3 roots, it cannot produce 3-root results. But how can one know if one's bhavanga citta has alobha, adosa and panya? Now bhavanga citta, you have to understand the bhavanga citta first. And bhavanga citta is very difficult to see. We are not aware of the bhavanga cittas arising and disappearing. Even when I am talking now and you are listening to me, there are thought processes going on in your mind, and each thought process is followed by moments of bhavangas, and then another thought process, then bhavanga, another thought process, and it is very difficult to see the bhavanga. It is almost impossible to know one's bhavanga citta has alobha, adosa and panya. Next question is, can you please explain the 4 ways of personality view, text page 267. One regards materiality as self, self as possessing materiality, materiality as in self, self as in materiality. Now, one regards materiality as self means one takes materiality to be self. Or one say, this is self. Let us say rupa. No? Materiality means rupa. Rupa is self. So this is one way of having the personality view. Rupa is self. Now the next is self as possessing materiality. That means rupa is the property of self. Self is one thing and rupa is another. So in the first, self and rupa are the same. He takes rupa as self. So self and rupa are same. But in the second one, self is one thing and rupa is another. And self possesses rupa. Or rupa is the property of self. So that is another way of personality view. And then materiality as in self. So that is, rupa is in self. There is rupa in the self. Self may be understood as something, say, something substantial, and then there is materiality or rupa in that self. Like there is a thing in the box or something like that. And then the fourth one is self as in materiality. So here there is self in rupa. So it is going one to another, right? So rupa in self and then self in rupa. So there are different ways of taking self, and so these are the 4 ways of taking self regarding materiality or rupa. And the same with the feeling, perception, mental formations and consciousness. Sanya make marks on the object which allow us to remember, but mind is a series of rising and disappearing of mental process. Thus sanya is also subject to this rule. How does each sanya able to keep the records, marks, memory when they are subject to change, when they are subject to not change, when they are subject to disappearing? In what way object that was previously marked by a sanya able to pass to the subsequent sanya? Now, we accept the momentary existence of states. So the mental states arise this moment and then it disappears. But there is another mental state arising, let's say sanya. One sanya arises and it disappears. And then there is another sanya. arising and disappearing, and there is another sanya, and so these sanyas arising are in one continuity. Since they arise in one continuity, the quality of the first sanya is inherited by the following sanya, and again the following sanya, and so on. So in this way, the memory or the sanya is maintained through this series of the arising and disappearing of sanya. Not that memory is permanent and exists all through to the end, but at every moment it is new. But since it is the outcome, or this is a follower of the former sanya, so it gets some of the qualities of the previous sanya, and so it is not what you call transfer, something like that. So it is transferred to the next moment, and so on. So memory is actually kept in this way. Not that memory is kept here or kept there at a place, but it is somewhere in our mental continuity. Now, we cannot say where it is stored, but it is there in our mental continuity, and so when we want to invoke that, then that becomes evident to us, and so we have the what is called the memory. Venerable Sir, thanks for your teaching. Here is my story, a son and his father. Week ago, my father called up asking for money to buy a car, because his car is old. But he tends to spend time enjoying in all the material things. Hence, I refused to give him the money while I spend it to further my study in next year. Both are suffering, right? Am I selfish? What's your view? It keeps bothering me. If you have the intention that your father suffer, then there may be some akusala for you. But if your intention is for your father not to spend in the enjoyment of worldly pleasures, but to further your study, I think it is all right. So you should not feel remorse or something about this. Okay.